Hi folks, in this video tutorial I'm going to go through AngularJS 1 with Spring MVC as a RESTful web service. So basically it's a step-by-step tutorial. So everything I'm going to discuss here is in this post step-by-step, displaying all the code, but we'll be looking at the very key points in this video tutorial, so they both will complement each other to get your first AngularJS application running with Spring RESTful web service. So I have already created a Spring RESTful web service. So if you hit this particular URL, so I'm running Tomcat in my local host 8080. Simple web is the web context, and entry is the URL that the dispatcher servlet is mapped to, and then v1 forecasting accounts.json is my RESTful web service. So if I hit this, I will get the JSON data back. So this JSON data back is very similar to the previous tutorials that we did. You got an account ID, name, and a balance. We got two records now, and the second record got an ID of 002, name is Peter, and balance is $386. So this is very similar to the previous Spring MVC tutorials that we did, but in this particular tutorial, instead of going all the way to the database, in the service layer I'm just returning some hard-coded value because the main focus in this tutorial is AngularJS. So if I go to the controller, I already have the account controller.java. So this is what the Spring MVC account controller, and we got all the Spring's REST controller annotations, and this is the URI v1 forecasting, and that's what we can see here, v1 forecasting. And we are calling, if I leave out the .json and just call accounts, it will be returning an XML output. So here, because I'm going to work with AngularJS, I'm interested in the JSON data, so I put a .json at the end so that it will return a JSON data. You can force this RESTful web service controller to return JSON all the time. Then what I need to do is, here I need to put another attribute called producers, and then I have to say this produces the JSON data all the time. So I'm saying produces, the media type is application.json value, and to make sure that it knows where the media type is, I do a Control-Shift-O, which is the organized import. It will bring in the media type from the Spring Framework's HTTP package. And now if I repackage this, run it, Maven clean install, repackage it and run it, then I don't have to suffix it with .json. So let's leave that aside, and then we are injecting an account service into the controller. So if I look at the account service, what it is doing is doing AccountService.getAccounts. So if I press the control key, I'll see an underline here, and if I open the implementation to go to the account service, the account service is at the moment just hard coding two accounts. So you've got a 001 John and 256, 002 Peter and 386. So if I go and look at my Spring RESTful web service, those are the hard-coded values that I'm getting it back from the RESTful web service call. And if you want to see under the covers what's happening is always a very handy tool is you press the F12 button. The F12 button will bring out this console, and I can go into the network and I can click on this, press again, and you can see the calls that are being made. See, there's a get call made, and you are making accounts.json. If I hover over below that, you can see the full address, which is localhost 8080, simple web entry, and it's going all the way to my server and retrieving all the values as a JSON data. So if I want to see what the data that is coming back, I highlight this again, and in the response I can see the data. These are the two data that are coming in. So now we know that there's already a controller that is returning RESTful web service. Now let's move to the AngularJS bit. So the AngularJS bit is another service that I'm going to call, and which is the entry, which is the same Spring dispatcher servlet is mapped to that. And but the UI now is going to a different controller. It's called the UIController, and then it's going to call the action accounts inside that. So if I go and look at my code here, under the same controller package, you have another controller called UIAccount controller. So this UIAccount controller has got a mapping of UI. So that's why when I'm calling here, it got an entry, which is a dispatcher servlet, same config, but the UI, it goes to a different controller. And under that, we got a URI mapping called accounts. So if I go to the UI mapping accounts, it is making a GET request, and all it is doing is returning a JSP page. So this JSP page is called accounts.jsp. So now we need to look at the accounts.jsp, and within the accounts.jsp is where there will be AngularJS code. So it's basically returning this page here. So this will be under source main web app. So I will minimize this. Then we go into source main web app, and under web app we got accounts. Under views we got accounts.jsp. So before quickly I look into the accounts.jsp, we look at the Spring configuration files. So in the configuration files, we got a very similar to what we configured in the previous Spring MVC RESTful web services. So we got a simple web configuration that enables the web MVC tutorial, and it says the pages that are served from here is a .jsp, which will be under webinf views. And also I have added another one for the resources. These are for the JavaScript resources, so I will come back to it later. And also we have a simple web app initializer that initializes the web application. So when the whole web application, the web app, the WAR file starts, Spring will basically come in and invoke this particular class. It will create an instance of this class and start invoking these methods. And that's where the simple web configuration is bootstrapped. We looked at it. That's defining the view resolver and the static resources for the JavaScript. And also it has got a dispatcher servlet that is mapped to the entry. So that's what we looked at. It's mapped to the entry here, the dispatcher servlet. And also the course filter. So when you have your JSP page coming from one domain and your RESTful web service calls coming from another domain, there's a restriction on the JavaScript that it can't make cross-domain calls. So if a JavaScripts are loaded from a one JSP file which has got this particular URI, which is entry UI accounts, and then it has to make RESTful web service calls to get the data from another domain URI, which is a V1 forecasting. There's a security restriction to say that no, you can't make a cross-domain call. So to overcome that, you make a course call. So you need to provide a course filter. So if you look at my Java interview questions and answers, and you go and type in course, there's already a few interview questions on course and why course are important. So in this course thing, we have basically added a course filter. So we look at the course filter quickly. So which is under source main Java filters, and here's the course filter. So basically this course filter is setting up few access headers. So when we download the JSP page, it's allowing to make cross-origin requests, and it's saying allow cross-origin requests to these methods, but you can basically tighten. So you can set the header and you can say anything with this particular, at the moment I'm saying is an asterisk star, that means for everything, every domain, but you can restrict by domain and say only for these domains allow cross-access calls. So the way the course works is first makes an option request, and option request will say, okay, allow these particular domains and allow these methods like post, get, put options or whatever, and then you should be able to make RESTful web service calls to get the data. And so we have also bootstrapped this coarse filter via this simple web app initializer. So now the next step is to go to the JSP page. So I'm going to file, close all these. So it's basically cluttering up. So I'm going to go into source main accounts.jsp. So firstly, in this account.jsp, I'm going to show quickly how to get AngularJS up and running in a quick and dirty way. And then we will go into more modularized, have their JavaScript in its own separate files and include them. And here I'm going to embed the AngularJS code inside the JSP itself. So this is a very simple JSP page, and it got Spring, Tanglip, C prefixes that we use in the Spring forms and things like that. And then there are very specific AngularJS. So anything like ng app, ng controller, ng repeat, these are all tags, AngularJS tags. So before we go in detail into this JSP page, if I look at this page here, and I'm going to bring out the UI accounts. So the controller in here, UIController, and under this UIController, anything with accounts will go in here and returns that page. So what the JSP is going to do is spit out the HTML with Angular tags in it. So if I go and hit the accounts here and go into the network and go and look at this accounts.page, in the response, you can see basically what you get is an HTML file. So this HTML file will have AngularJS tags in it. So you got, it's a very simple body tag, and then you got an ng app. ng app is the entry point into the AngularJS. So you can think of it as Java has got a main method to get an entry point. Similar way, you got an ng app. Then ng controller is to say this is the controller. So AngularJS itself on the client side, it got the concept of model, view, and controller. So model is the data, view is this particular HTML document that you are looking at, and the controller, we will look at it in a minute, which will have the logic. And then you will have the controller that ties up the view and the model together. So the controller will set the data on the model object, and then the view will take the data out from the model and will display it as shown here. So it's basically an HTML file here, and then we got the script. So this is what the AngularJS library. So we are including the importing the AngularJS library directly from the HTTPS location. But in real projects, what you will be doing is you will be downloading the AngularJS library, and then you will be putting it into one of the static resources, and then you will be importing it via that. That way you have more control over the AngularJS. So you will have a static, then you will have a AngularJS a JS library folder, and inside that you will have the AngularJS library already imported. But in this example, I'm directly downloading it from this URI, and I'm just using the 1.44 AngularJS version. And then what I have next to that is basically the AngularJS code, which is embedded into the JavaScript itself. So this is basically inside the body tag. So now I'm going to explain this app and AngularModule and so on, which are very relevant to the AngularJS. So firstly, on a high level, like a crash course, if you look at my AngularJS interview questions and answers, I'm going through all the different questions that will get you really started with AngularJS. On a high level, AngularJS got the concept of thing called module. So everything is a module. So when you create a module, you create an ng app. So ng app is like a main method in Java. So that's an entry point. So when you say ng app, so you're basically saying, okay, I'm using AngularJS in my client side. And then ng app will have the view. The view is nothing but the DOM. So that's basically the HTML data that you have. So that's the HTML template is your view. and the view has got certain AngularJS directives. So this ng-app, ng-repeat, ng-bind, etc. are AngularJS directives. And then here the ng-controller is another directive. We are defining the controller. So now if I go back to the here, so you have the AngularJS controller, then controller will register itself with the module. So module will have a controller, and then $scope is like the model. So the $scope is where within the controller you set a model value, say $scope.firstname. Then inside the controller you will set the first name to John or whatever. Then in the view with the double curly brackets you can access that value. So basically the controller sets a value to the $scope model, and then the view will access it using ng-bind, or it can also use something like double curly braces and then say first name. That's basically the value that was set to the $scope in the controller. So in this case I'll remove that because we're already using the ng-bind. There's an ng-bind and the ng-model. ng-model allows you to do a two-way binding, and ng-bind allows you just a one-way. So you set it in the controller and then the view can see it. So now if you look at the code very closely, first what you're doing is a variable declaration in JavaScript. So we do var app equals angular.module, and I'm registering a very simple module app. I'm calling it simple angular.js app. Now you can ask, how do I know what API to use it? So like in Java development, you're building a Spring applications or a core Java or whatever, you always have a Java API handy, and also you will have a Spring API handy. So you will look at what functions to call, what parameters a function takes, and so on. Similarly, you have that in AngularJS as well. So here I want to know the module, what the controller is. So here I'm saying the view is here, and the $scope is where you set the value. So in the controller you will say controller scope dot first name equals John, and the view will take first name as John. And also these views got the different directives. That's what we looked at: ng-app, ng-model, ng-bind, and so on. So AngularJS APIs, that's in particular URI. I have already mentioned the URI in the step-by-step. So if you open up this URI, which is a doc.angularjs.org API, and you look at functions, here we are calling a function called angular.module. So if I look at the angular.module here, so if I click on the angular.module, basically it's saying is give it a module name, and then it takes an array, and this basically an array of any external dependencies that you may have. So in this case I don't have any dependencies, so I'm providing an empty array list. And now this is the name, simple angularjs.app is the name I'm giving to the module. So once you get the module, so basically the documentation is saying once you get the module here, it returns an object of type angular.module. So if I click on the angular.module here, or I can also go through the ng types here, which has got the Angular module. So if I look at the type, you have the Angular module. So I can either click on here, or I can see the return type, and there's a clickable link here. So I click on the module. Then says once you have defined the module, you can call number of different functions on the module. So you can call value, you can call service to register a service, you can call controller to register a controller, you can call filter. So in this case I'm going to call a controller. So I'm going to register a controller with my module, and all it takes is a name. So it takes a name of the controller, and also it takes a constructor function. So which the constructor function is doing is giving some functionality what the controller should do when it is called. So if I go back to my code again here now, so we're going app. So this is the app that we created by registering a module, which is an entry point. Then on the app, which returns an object of type Angular.module. So this is a component. So API reference says this is an ng, type components in ng, and under that you have Angular.module. So it returns an Angular.module, and Angular.module has got a function called controller. So now I'm going to call a function called controller here. And inside the controller, the function takes a name. So I'm going to name my controller account.controller. This is the name I'm providing here under the ng controller, says account.controller, and I'm assigning to a thing called as CTRL control. So that's why I'm saying this is the controller. So that's the name account controller that I have assigned here, account controller. So the controller name is registered with Angular now. Now inside this, now I'm going to call my RESTful web service because I need some data. So inside the controller, when the controller is just registered, I'm going to this RESTful web service that returns this data. So I'm getting the data through AngularJS and then populating it here. So AngularJS is responsible for populating this data by making a RESTful web service call, which is a Spring MVC RESTful web service call, getting the data back, and then populating it with this ng bind and ng repeat, which are AngularJS directives. So in order to make a call, I've provided the name, and then the API tells me that I need to provide a constructor, which is a function. So I need to provide a function that knows how to go to make a RESTful web service, get the data, and assign it to the model. So to do that, I'm calling a function, and then inside the function I'm passing $scope and $HTTP. So in Spring we looked at dependency injection. So the way we have dependency injection in AngularJS, you have @inject, which is a dependency injection, and this $HTTP and is a service. So this $HTTP is a HTTP service that we can use to make RESTful web service calls. And $scope is what we looked at earlier, which binds. $scope is an AngularJS thing that binds a view and a controller, so view and the model. So the controller will set the $scope some value so that view can take the value. So this is basically decoupling your controller and the view via the $scope. One sets it and the other one takes the data out of the $scope. So if I look at the API here, and $HTTP will be defined as one of the services. And if you look into the $HTTP, you have a method called get here, HTTP get, and it tells you what the method takes. So you pass the URI to the get method. So there are different ways you can call this API. So what I'm going to use is to call this handy get method that takes the URL, and also you need to pass some kind of, it returns you a HTTP promise object, and on the HTTP promise object you can say then do this. So you get a return value as a response, and you can do something with the response. And also I'm going to check, if I search for the $scope here, you can say http.get URL $scope my object, so you can set a value here. So let's go back here, and inside the function we are dependency injecting the $scope and $HTTP. So this $HTTP is a service, and $scope is your model you can set the value to. And then this is the URL we are passing, which is a URL to get the accounts as a JSON data. So this is the same as what we have invoked here as a JSON data. And then we call a then. So this returns a future object or a future object, a promise. A promise means a data will be returned in the future. It is a promise that asynchronously, because the web service call has to go to the server back, and then Spring MVC will look at the data, get the data, and pass it back. So it won't be instantaneous. So It is a promise that some data will be returned, and when the then function is called, you will get the response data back. And I'm printing in the console.log, starting to fetch accounts. And this is the key part. In the $.scope, this is the $scope that we passed. I'm setting a variable called accounts, and I'm setting that with the response or data. Whatever the response data that has come back as a .json file, I'm setting it to the $scope accounts. And if it is an error, so that then takes a success function and an erroneous function. So the first one is a success function, and this is an erroneous function. It will print it to the console as an error. Then I can see the $scope accounts being set. Now I can use this accounts data here. So what I'm doing is I'm using ngRepeat. ngRepeat is like a for each loop in Java for accounts, and each account in this accounts model object that we have already set it to the $scope, which is the $scope.accounts. For each account, get the value. So then you say account.id, account.name, and account.balance, and you are setting it by the ngbind. And this ID, name, and balance are nothing but these ID, name, and balance in the JSON data. This is a typical JSON data. Got an array. The 0th index is ID, name, balance. First index, ID, name, balance. So this is a very simple, quick and dirty code. So we have embedded everything into the JavaScript itself. And if I do Maven clean install and get the target WAR file, and I deployed the WAR file which I have already deployed, that's why it's running. So you go and basically deploy to the Tomcat installation web apps folder. So you go to projects, not projects, C, tools, Apache Tomcat, and inside the Apache Tomcat you got the web apps, and it's already the simple.web.war is already deployed. And if I make this call here, I'm getting the data back as expected. Now let's go and see some debugging tips in AngularJS. So I've gone into the network, I've seen this data that is coming in. Then what I can do is, if I go into my debugger, so this you get it from the F12, so which is or you can click on it here, developer tools, and then you look at the developer toolbars, and you can select the debugger here. So if I look at the debugger here, I can see my accounts. So if I click on the accounts, I can see the HTML here, and I want to put a breakpoint when we're just starting to fetch this and when we get the data back from the RESTful web service call. So if I click on it, so there's a breakpoint is there, and you can also see a checkbox and a tick in here. And also you can see in the console it prints starting to fetch accounts. So that's what I'm printing here. So that's another way to debug. You can put some console.log statements and say starting to fetch accounts. There are other Angular based tools for Chrome that will give you a more holistic debugging capabilities. Those tools all mentioned in the AngularJS interview questions and answers part 2. In this case, I'll just only look at a very simple way to debug. This is a way you would debug any other Spring MVC web app application. So using these browsers developer tools. So here I've already set the debug point. So it should stop at this point before it makes a RESTful web service call. So now I do a refresh this URL here. You can see started running, nothing is populated here. So now it has stopped here. So how do I know it has stopped here? I can say step in, step out, and play buttons. So at this point, we know that it would have already printed out the console, started fetching, and also the response would have come back. So on the right hand side, if I look at it, I've got the response object here, and inside the response object I can see a data field, a variable, so .data, and inside the data I can see two objects that have come back. One is the balance 256, ID 001 and name is John. Another one is object 1 is balance $386, ID 002 and name. So now the data has come back. Now the data is getting assigned to the accounts, and then what will happen is NG will go and populate these values. So it will go to the controller, and then it will look at the account, and then it will look out for each account. It will print the ID, name and balance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to not going to step out of here. I'm just going to play all the way through. Now the data has come back. So this clearly shows that the AngularJS in action, it making a RESTful web service call, taking the data back and displaying it. So this is all good, but in larger projects, you won't be embedding your AngularJS code, and you need to modularize it and write it in a modular fashion. So in order to do that, what we have to do is change this code. So basically, I'm going to remove all the script that I have added here, which is a quick and dirty. So this script, you can find out both ways of doing it in the step-by-step tutorial. I've specified both the code. So now if I go in here and I'm going to delete this script bit, and I'm going to import a few JS script files, that AngularJS files that I've already created. So I've already backed this up. So I'm going to bring this back in here. So I'm going to Control C here and put the Control V. So what it is saying is basically static JS app.js file. Then second JS is this is the entry point, just like a main method. And this is another file called static JS for JavaScript, a service component. So I'm calling it the AccountService.js. Another file called static JS controller AccountController.js. Now I save this, and if I want to look at all these files, and also I need to make some changes here. This is a control, and here I need to call it ctrl control.accounts, because the accounts will be in the context of the controller here. And we are going to write more like industrial strength JavaScript code. So here is under source main web app. I've got a static folder. So we are saying everything is relative to the static folder. And also in the Spring controller, I have already specified that inside the UI, not the UI controller, sorry, in the configuration, under simple web app initializer, we have the course filter for cross-domain call, and in the simple web configuration, in addition to the view resolver, I'm also saying add a resource handler that will take everything from static, and asterisk means any folder. So anything from the static onwards, it'll be getting all those JS files. So inside the JS file from the static folder, which is under source main web app static folder, firstly I have the app.js. So if I open the app.js, the UseStrict is a JavaScript way of saying be strict in evaluating. So don't make any variables that are read-only, so that it won't allow you to assign a value to a read-only variable. If you have an object that are not extendable to add new properties, the UseStrict variable will throw an error if you try to add a new property to a non-extendable object, and so on. So it won't allow you to do any implicit JavaScript variables and so on. So most of the JavaScript file will use this UseStrict construct. Then similar way we created before, we are creating a variable called app and angular.module. So we already looked at the Angular API in the angular.module function, and we are registering a module. So if you look at angular.module here, and you're just giving it a name, and then in this case I'm not going to have any other external dependency module, so it is an empty array. That's all the app.js is. So if I close this app.js, so we can tick the app.js here that we have looked at, and next one is the controller. So before we look at the controller, we load the service. So basically in Java and all, we looked at the single responsibility principle where you don't put all the logic. So in before, a quick and dirty way, we put the RESTful web service call inside the controller itself, which is fine. What if there's another controller that needs the same service? Then you need to replicate that same logic into another controller and so on, which is not reusable. So the single responsible principle says it should do one thing. So we abstract out this RESTful web service call logic into the account service. So account service is another AngularJS module. We define it through a factory, and basically this is responsible for RESTful data, making a RESTful web service call to the your Spring MVC and get the data and then pass it to the controller. So it's mainly a reusable function. It can be used by any controllers or any other filters or whatever. It can be reused. So in order to do that, what we are doing is we are doing the angular.module and getting the same module back. And in order to register a service, we need to call the .factory. So you can also see here, there will be a .factory method. And also in here, in the AngularJS, we can see the factory is used to register a service, provider, value, and so on. You do an app, and then you do app.factory and pass it a name of your service, and you will be registering with that particular module the new service. You can also call a service. There's a subtle difference between a service and a factory calls. These all covered in the AngularJS interview questions and answers. So here we are factory registering it, and I'm going to call this service the My Account service. You got to give it a name you're registering with, and $HTTP and $Q. So $HTTP is a service to make RESTful web service we have already looked at, and $Q is more like to make asynchronous calls. You can also look at the $Q in the API. So $Q is a service that allows you to, if you are making, in this case, I'm only making one RESTful web service call, but if you're making 10 or 20 RESTful web service calls, you need to queue those service calls, and one after the other that will be executed to the backend service. So it's like a queuing service. And then we are creating a function. So we are basically injecting these two values. So this is a dependency injection here of the service and queue, because we are going to use it inside. And then we are making a function here that takes in those $HTTP and a queue. And then I'm defining a constant here, which is a RESTful web service called URI. It's accounts.json. That'll make a RESTful web service call to get the data. Then I'm creating a function here, and inside the factory, what I'm saying is GetAllAccount will get all the accounts. So that's basically calling this function here. And you need to return a factory object. So this GetAllAccount is basically a function that makes use of the $Q service and the $HTTP, and it will be making a RESTful web service call like that it made before, and then it will be getting the response data, and this response data will be passed to the controller. So we have now isolated or abstracted out the RESTful web service call logic into the My Account service. And this will be returning a deferred promise, or promise that there will be a data, and then from the deferred, if it fails, it's a success condition, and this is a failure condition. If it is a success condition, it will be doing deferred, and it will be calling the reject call. If it is a success condition, it will be making a deferred.resolve call, and this is where you'll be getting the response.data. Now the third part is now the account controller. Now we got the service abstracted out. We can be used from any controller. In this case, I'm defining a controller, so I'm calling it the account.controller, because this account.controller is what we are using in the account JSP page, account.controller. So this controller will be making use of the $scope. So $scope we have already looked at. That's the model binding. So we set it from the controller, and the view can take the value. we are injecting this my account service. See this my account service, we have already registered with that name, my account service. So we can inject the my account service here, and we pass it to this function $scope, and then whatever the my account service that we are passing it here to the past account service. I'm just using a different name just to show that this my account service can be passed into this function. And inside the function, I'm assigning a variable called self, which is this itself. And to the self, I'm setting a variable called accounts. And this account is nothing but an empty array. And now here, I'm setting self.accounts is equal to the data. So whatever the data that gets sent. So self.accounts is this, and it gets the data out from the account service data, and the self.accounts is set to this data here. So it is in the scope of the controller CTRL, and once the accounts is set, we can go in here and say CTRL control dot accounts, and we can get the data back from the way we did before, and we can do account.id, account.name, account.balance, etc. So now what we have done is we have clearly defined it into the main module app.js, and in here we take the app.js module and register a service. This service via the factory function call, and this service will make use of the $HTTP and $Q to make a RESTful web service call and get the data, and then $controller will make use of the this account service, and whatever the data the account service gets it and bind it to the .control, and to the .control whatever the value that it has taken is now looped through with the ng repeat directive, and we can display all the values. So now what I have to do is go in here, click on it. This is a typical Maven application. If you're not familiar with Maven, you need to look at one of those previous tutorials that goes through step by step setting up Java, Maven, Eclipse, etc. So I'm going to run as Maven install, which is going to package it. So it's basically packaged it into this target folder. This is the Maven structure. So if I refresh it, this one. So I got a simple web.war file here. So I copy this. I'm going to paste it here. The Tomcat is already running, but what Tomcat is going to do is it's going to do a hot deploy. So while it's hot deploying it, if I go and try to hit this, it'll throw an error because the service is down. So it'll take some time. So you will see this one is configured and deployed. So you can see here, you have to keep an eye out. If there's any error, it'll be thrown here. At the moment, we are not seeing any errors here. Now I hit the JSON data again, it comes back. So I'm going to go and refresh my accounts again. Now the data has come back. Now if you'll inspect the file, if I click on the network, and you can see AngularJS module is loaded, my app.js module is loaded, AccountService.js is loaded, AccountController.js is loaded. So if I hover over here, that's the path the Spring has provided those. So it's basically localhost 8080, simple web, and under that static, then the JS. These are the folder structure that we have provided in Eclipse, service and AccountService.js. Similar way, account.controller. If I hover over there, I can see the path, how it has taken those resources. And it is also important, these resources can be easily downloaded, so you don't put any security, any business logic or whatever that can violate the security, because that can be easily downloaded. As you can see, using this URL, you can download those JavaScripts. So now in here, if I look at the accounts, and if I look at the code here, it's slightly different. You can see account controller here. You can see control.accounts because we have changed the JSP file. And also we also don't have any embedded JavaScript code. Everything is in these files here: simple web static, JS, app.js, service account, AccountService.js, AccountController.js, and so on. And if I want to debug here, I just click on this. I go to one of these files here. Say I want to debug the controller, so I click on the controller. And if I want to see what data that is coming back in D, so I click on here on the line 14. This is checked, so we got a debug point here. So if I go and click on here, it's going to stop at that point, and then I can inspect what D is. If I select the D, look at the D here, D is the array of data, see the balance, ID, name, and so on. And you got two array objects, so there's two data, so that's what we'll be getting back via the D here, and we are assigning that to the self.accounts. And you can also put a breakpoint on the service if you are debugging, so you can click on the service and say I want to put a debug point here to see when this is called and what the response to data is. So in this case, I'm going to let this go through, and I'm going to put a thing again, and it's going to stop on the service now because the service get called by the controller. You can see the defer.resolve, it stopped here. And if I want to inspect what's in the response, I go in here and look for the response object. This is here, this is the response, which is of type object. And inside the response.data, see here the data here, and you can see 001 ID, name, and so on. So that's all for this tutorial, and it's very important that you have the AngularJS thing handy. And if you're interested in looking at the inside the Angular module, so if you say inside the $HTTP, so the $HTTP, how the $Q and all those different functions are working, you can click on it, and I'm calling a $HTTP.get method here. If you go to the get method, it's returning a future object of type promise. Then in one of the links, you will see the promise object, which is a $Q. So if I go and click here on $Q, it will tell you how the $Q works, and it takes a function. These are the defer.resolve, defer.reject that we have been using, and it'll return the value. It's a promise to return the value, so you call a function on the promise so that to extract out the response data. So in the next tutorial, basically I will be going through all the way, so we will be using the full RESTful web service call that will be going all the way to the database. We're getting the value from database via Hibernate, and then we'll be doing a number of other things, like not only displaying the data, we will make a one create call with a post request to see how forms will work in AngularJS. So we will create a new object, a new account via the UI itself. We'll be clicking on new account, it'll be creating, and we'll be getting all the data back, including the new account that we have created and so on. That's all for this tutorial. We'll see in the next AngularJS tutorial with Spring MVC.